Okay. Here too. Councillor Beatty, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
Oh, hello. Huzzah. We can hear you too. Huzzah. And for the benefit of everybody in the room, you may notice that the PA system is cleaner because Josh and the Navy guy from K-Code Media we're working with cleaned up the delay. So the PA in the room should be better. So yay for that. Sorry to everybody at City Hall who heard the really loud squeal whale sounds this morning. But I think we're in a better spot because we are very aware that there was issues last week. Thank you, sir. There were issues last week at the Planning Commission meeting, but I think we've addressed them. So Lisa, I don't know if you heard, but last week there was the people on Zoom at the meeting had feedback that the people in the room did not hear. So if you start to get any feedback or issues, please message me or email me and we'll see what we can do. But
okay.
It was only for the folks in Zoom hearing it, not nobody in the room here.
Okay. Okay.
Good. Are we expecting Kathy?
Also, just so you know, I'm going to start the meeting on camera, but I actually have some late lunch cooking, so I'm going to turn my camera off at one point for about 10 minutes while I eat.
Perfect.
We're on air.
All right. Welcome everyone to the work session for October 18th. The entirety of it will be about high density residential zones, and it'll be presented by our senior planner, Vera Coleus, and our associate planner, Adam Haro. Welcome.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Yeah.
Share my screen. And, okay, so hopefully that's presenting properly. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much. We're here for this. This work session is in advance of a public hearing that will be scheduled for later in December. And what we'll be talking about today is our high density residential zones, consolidation of those zones, and some clarifications to definitions and some adjacent amendments that go with when we start gluing zones together for both uses and for development standards. The slide here talks about what our review schedule has been to date. So we had 3 pretty intense work sessions with the Planning Commission in advance of the public hearing that we held with them near the end of September. The recommendation was unanimous, a recommendation for council to approve the code package amendment. They made a couple of additional recommendations that we'll talk about as well towards the end of the presentation. Of course, today is the work session. We get the whole thing. It's great. So we can really dig into this code amendments. We'd like to hear some feedback from you folks. If there's anything that you would like us to come back to or come back with on December 6th for the public hearing for the code adoption. This map, this is our zoning map showing our existing zones. In particular, we're talking about our high-density residential zones. You might remember the zoning that we did with our moderate density zones prior to. So what we have now are our high-density residential zones, again, R3 down through R1B. And originally, as part of that comprehensive plan implementation project, we had hoped to tackle the consolidation of these zones as well. But there were some complications related to the uses as they present themselves across the zones. And so we took the opportunity to sort of hold off on that and come back to you with a different package of amendments that relates just to these high density zones. And we took the opportunity to also work on some of those definitions and clarifications as well. So that's why this package is separate from that original comprehensive plan implementation project. This map here shows just the high density zones. So you can see generally where they are. They're mostly in and around our commercial areas. So sort of in and around the downtown, central Milwaukie, and then around the King Road Shopping Center as well. The total acreage in our high density zones is approximately 330 acres. So it's not a lot in comparison to the rest of our zones. About 70% of the city is zoned that RMD, or that moderate density residential. So the high density residential zone really does encompass a much smaller proportion of our residential properties. And the next couple of slides are just sort of some aerials to show you where some of our high density zones are, and some snapshots of what the development is in them. Most of these lots are already developed, mostly with high density residential development or multi-unit developments. So we can see here the Kellogg Creek, this is our R1 zone. So we can see the Kellogg Creek apartments, as well as the apartments that are along Railroad, Harmony, and Linwood. They're on the right-hand side. Just to give you a flavor of sort of what some of these areas look like, we see the Waverly complex in our R2 zone, as well as the apartments that are along Lake Road. They're on the right-hand side as well. In our R2 zone, we also have some of these apartments that are along Lake Road and as well as River Road. And then in our R3 zone, there are a couple of different areas here on 34th. In Harrison, as well as the Providence Hospital site is actually zoned R3. And then finally, we have the Brookside Apartments. They're along Johnson Creek. And there's an apartment development there at Howe and 43rd as well. And those are R3 zones. And then finally, we have some R3 around the King Road Shopping Center. And we have 7 lots zoned R2.5. That's just this little square there. So that's part of our high density zones as well. Those R2.5 lots were zoned pretty specifically for some development right there. So we've got, we have 5 high density residential zones. So what we're really hoping to do is consolidate those and simplify the map, as well as streamline and work on some of our definitions. So that's kind of setting us up for where we are. I'm going to have Adam start on the first part of this presentation, but are there any questions? Sorry, I want to think about pausing.
Was there redevelopment of those lots that are R2.5?
Great question, Councilor Beatty. As yet, no. The remaining ones were rezoned a couple, 3 years ago, I think. Brett Kelver handled that rezoning. They were intended to be redeveloped, I believe, into duplexes, but that hasn't happened as yet, no.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, thank you. So why update Milwaukee's high density zones? It's been a city council priority in the implementation of the comprehensive plan. One of the goals is to consolidate and simplify the zones, including the high density zones and the RMD, which has already been done. Also removing bias from the code. Milwaukie treats allowed uses with similar land use impacts in some disparate ways, which we'll talk about a little bit in the next few slides. Also update outdated terminology to better match terms that are being used by the state. And then streamline some of the overly complicated use categories and review processes. So these are the existing terms as they appear in the Milwaukie City Code. This table is included, I think, in the staff report. We propose revising these outdated terms to better reflect the uses in our building code and those used for the purposes of licensing the top 4 uses in this table at the state. So here's a table that's meant to illustrate some of the issues with the allowed uses. You can see some highlighting here for outdated terms and some of the inconsistency in review processes. So as I mentioned, the state of Oregon does not use the 4 highlighted terms in its licensing of community-based care settings, and the city has typically used the state's terms when issuing certificates of occupancy for buildings. Also, definitions of congregate housing facility and residential home are quite old and date back to federal legislation in 1978 and 1988. And none of the neighboring jurisdictions that we researched use the word or the term residential home in their codes. So it seemed like a good one to change and shift. I'll also add that city code does not define nursing or convalescent home in the code currently, but we do have specific standards for approving them in the community service use section of the code. And then also congregate housing facilities are treated like multi-unit developments, and despite having similar land use impacts, senior and retirement housing is subject to a conditional use process in several of these zones, as you can see on the table.
If I could just jump in for 1 second, part of this trying to modernize and update these terms, if you remember the Rusk Road senior development, we had as staff a really difficult time trying to figure out what parts of that development were what land use per our code, because we had some things are defined, some aren't. They were similarly defined, but called out separately. So part of this was also kind of in some ways, we learned from that experience and trying to really streamline our terms so that we are consistent with the state, even with jurisdictions as well. But also just that experience showed us that we needed to update and modernize the code as well.
So had our code at that time been what you hope to have it be when we are done here, would they necessarily have had to do I forget what it was called, planned development?
They had to go through they did a type 3 development because they had a conditional use and a community service use. Part of their issue though, too, is that it was a split zone. Part of that property was an R10, part of it was an R2 zone. But had it all been in the R2 zone, we wouldn't have had to go through all of that extra level of review. It would have been design and development standards, notwithstanding the natural resources and the floodplain, so that aside, but just as the housing type or the development type that it was.
So it wouldn't have had to have been a planned unit development.
Correct.
Wasn't that where they ended up landing?
They started that way and then ended up in a different way. So their townhomes and that whole thing, that was a planned development. And then they shifted over to the extended care senior facility. But that was the one that I remember the staff meetings trying to figure out what parts of that were what thing, and it made it really confusing. So this will help staff as well as applicants to figure out what we're doing.
When I was reading the staff report and you talked about residential home and that adult foster care makes perfect sense to me as a more clear term, but I thought I recalled that residential home also included things like Oxford houses and homes of people who are in treatment or mental health care or other kinds of things, and not just the adult foster care. Is that not true?
To your question, Counselor Bay, so the types of facilities like the Oxford House or those sorts of treatment facilities are protected by federal law, so we cannot exclude them from residential zones. So we've always just known them kind of, I guess I would say sort of anecdotally in some ways, we were thinking about them the same way as a residential home just for purposes of allowing them in residential zones. But because they have a whole separate level of protection, yes, that they are permitted in our residential zones as they are proposed, as you understand them. So, yes.
Okay, but they're not covered in these definitions, really?
Correct.
Okay,
As they are right now, no.
okay. And maybe you're going to get into this. Can you explain what the process is for, I mean, I know like most of these kind of facilities listed on this chart have to have some kind of state or county certification because they're doing healthcare in different forms. What's the process when someone comes in? And now I'm not thinking about the large senior housing complexes that are built to be that, but with the residential homes or the adult foster care homes, what's the process when someone seeks to change an existing home to use that way, or build a home, purpose-built home to use that way? Where does the state licensing come in vis-a-vis the city's permitting and stuff like that?
Great question. So from the planning side, we review, it all comes in through the building permit process. So there's not a land use review process. Planning will review it from a zoning standpoint to make sure that the way it's designed appears to fit our definition, of a residential home. And any of the state licensing, that's part of the permit review process, I believe, through how the building official is reviewing things for a number of bedrooms and that sort of thing. I believe that's where the state licensing piece comes in. It's through that permit review process with the building department. Planning we don't check or verify those things. The building official, I believe, is part of that process.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so these are the terms that we are proposing to essentially replace the other terms that are in the code now. As Councilor Beatty pointed out, adult foster care home is replacing in a sort of a one-for-one residential home. That's how the state of Oregon defines it. And that threshold is also defined by the state of up to 5 people. So anything more than that, and you tip into another kind of facility. And that is a residential care facility, which is also a term used by the state, several other jurisdictions, including Tigard and I believe Beaverton use similar terms to sort of group these types of facilities. So there are other jurisdictions doing it. And there are some subtypes to that. Assisted living facility, nursing facility, and memory care community are kind of the 3 that are most common. And these uses here, what we're proposing on the use table is really to use 2 of these: adult foster care home and then residential care facility. And these others would not necessarily be defined in our code because they are terms that the state defines. And so, yeah.
So where does a facility that provides a continuum of care approach, how do you deal with that in permitting? With a succinct answer there, but those are like Willamette View has all of those options. Right. Do you just hold it to the highest, basically the most restricted or most regulated?
Do you want to take that?
Of those?
I think if they're providing, several facilities will be cited and have, say, a memory care community alongside an assisted living facility. And in the past, they've had to pursue, because one is more like a nursing home, a separate process for that, and a CSU process for that, and then a CU, potentially, depending on the zone, for the assisted living facility.
Okay, and so it kind of comes out in the wash with the building official, more or less,
and I
with
think
each
what
different building. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and what we're proposing is to maybe not distinguish too much between them. And
yeah, that makes sense.
We can move on to unless there's any other questions about this slide, we can.
Do you want to? Okay.
We want to get a sense from the council if you all agree and or concur with the proposed definition changes that we have put together here. And then also, do you agree with the concept of essentially consolidating those different facility types underneath residential care facility?
Maybe I'll put this slide up because this is sort of our summary slide of those things. Are there any questions or issues with that part of it?
Looks good.
Okay. Okay.
So if we're not going to define the subparts, are we cross-referencing state law where those definitions are? I mean, I do think we need to do that, I guess I would say. If we think they're adequately defined in state law, then that's great. Why reinvent the wheel? But it does seem like we ought to somehow cross-reference that.
If I could, Councilor Beatty, the way we've proposed the definition is for a residential care facility, and we're using the terminology means a licensed living facility. So we're using the term licensed as a way of getting to the state licensing without calling out exactly where it's licensed in case references change. And then we include the language, this use classification includes but is not limited to assisted living facilities, nursing facilities, and memory care facilities as a way of providing some examples of those types of facilities. But the term that's actually defined is residential care facility. And we link it to the state by using the term that it's a licensed facility. Do you think, are you suggesting, should we look at more specific language? Would that make it clearer for you? I'm just curious, is there something else we could be adding to that?
Well, I guess I don't feel as strongly about those kind of facilities because they are typically built by institutions or big companies who probably know what all that means, and that licensing will be enough of a clue. It may be the residential homes where I feel like we need more direction because those tend to be individual, residents who are not necessarily businesses and do not necessarily have all the business acumen. So, I mean, I don't feel particularly strongly about that, I guess.
If I could, to your point about the adult foster care homes, we similarly call out in the definition that it's operated to provide a permanent residence and licensed care for up to 5 people. So again, we're pulling that licensure piece into that as well. So we are tying it to what the state licensing requirements would be to operate such a facility.
And do we put out like fact sheets on this kind of stuff, or we just sort of answer questions when somebody walks into the door?
The latter. We have not done a fact sheet. I mean, if there are things like that we can borrow, we're not the experts on the licensing requirements of these facilities, but if there's something that we can maybe pull from the state to help folks, we could certainly do that. But generally we ask questions as they come up. Yeah.
All right, so the focus of our second Planning Commission work session was the term boarding house, and this is how it exists in the code currently. It was last updated in 2016, so fairly recently as part of the short-term rental process. I wasn't able to find out the exact rationale behind the change, but currently there are no boarding houses in the city of Milwaukie that we know of, and despite being allowed by conditional use in the residential zone since 1946. So here's a brief sort of history of what we're proposing to replace boarding house with, which is single room occupancy dwellings, which have the term's been around for a very, very long time, over 150 years. To describe low-cost residential hotels, boarding houses, rooming houses, lodging houses, and the renting out of rooms in private apartments. Typically, there's a shared kitchen, some eating facilities, and sometimes there are shared bathrooms. There are also separated units in these this type of housing. And as well as oftentimes there are other services included. Here you can see the workers at an Alabama munitions plant in 1941 eating a communal dinner after the workday, I assume, or maybe it's breakfast. It served as a bedrock of affordable housing for laborers in American cities for quite a while. Here you can see a very lively boarding house in New York City, I think around the same period as the last photo. There were also, however, upscale SROs that provided housing for people of middle and higher incomes. So I don't know how wealthy Edgar Allan Poe was, but I know that he stayed in a lot of SROs. And then the emergence of really affordable single-family homes in the suburbs really shifted the demographics and income levels of SRO residents as people fled urban areas. So here we've got housing choice of last resort. Really, SROs have become bottom of the market for affordability, really due to decreased demand for them and decreased demand for living in urban centers over the last 100 years until more recently when that has shifted. There's an increased stigmatization of poverty in relation to SROs, single-person households, as well as those with disabilities and mental illness. And that really led to a lot more people needing to live in this kind of housing of last resort. Also just inadequate services at these properties historically, problematic design elements, people being packed in not humanely in the past. And also it can be a somewhat chaotic, high contact living environment that is not suitable for everyone. So a lot of cities banned SROs in the past, and the US in the meantime has lost as many as 2 million or more SRO units since 1970, and the ones that exist now continue to be lost as that kind of housing choice. So there's been a lot of movement and development in different cities and also efforts to preserve existing SROs. Here we have the Joyce Hotel in Portland, which was bought by the Portland Housing Bureau to preserve that housing so folks didn't end up on the street. They've really been meant to reduce houselessness and stabilize those existing residents. And there have also been some new SRO developments, some that are affordable, by the tied to certain MFI income levels and whatnot, that intend to improve upon the historical model of SROs. And there's also a trend where cities like Seattle and Portland and many others are developing new market rate SROs that are more akin to adult dorm living, that have more services and more amenities. So here's a few examples of some recent investment in SROs in Portland. So at the top is a new development called Cedar Commons by Central City Concern. Central City Concern owns a large share of the SROs in the region, and they pretty much across the board include supportive housing services in their model. Bottom left is Findlay Commons, also Central City Concern project at 54th and Powell. And by the way, Cedar Commons is at 115th and Division for those who mentally want a picture. Also includes supportive services at Findlay Commons. And the bottom right is the Broadway Hotel, just to share an example of an existing SRO that is still in operation in downtown Portland. So this here is our definition of SRO that we are proposing to replace boarding house with. I don't know if I should read it or if we.
I think one of the things that we did talk about in the definition is that they would be permitted outright in any residential zones that permit multi-unit development. So we wanted to consider them a multi-unit development. Same as an apartment complex, they're just a little bit different, but that they're not a conditional use anymore, that they would be permitted just like an apartment complex would be. Subject to the same standards and so on, but the use category is part of what we're changing as part of the consolidation.
I'm not sure this slide is reading correctly. I think our edit to this slide did not go through all the way. The bottom right cell should say single room occupancy as the new use type, I believe. But
Yep, it should.
I think that was just a
Yep, typo.
typo there. But this is assuming single room occupancy is just repeated there on the bottom right. This is the sum of everything that we're proposing, shifting and changing definitions of. And I guess there's more that Vera will go over around the specific changes and how they're reflected in the use table and all that. But I think the next slide is asking, essentially, does council support retiring the term boarding house and replacing it with single room occupancy?
I have a question. What's the difference between an SRO as defined in the new definition and an extended stay Holiday Inn?
Are you asking from a code standpoint or just what it feels like? That was different.
Whichever one you prefer. I'm just curious in general about that, because when I'm reading that definition, I'm trying to puzzle through my own.
It's a great question, and this actually came up at Planning Commission as well. And the way we would think about that is, an extended stay hotel or something like that is a commercial use. And we are considering, and this may or may not answer your question, but that SROs they're a residential use, that folks are, depending on how long they're staying, we understand that some folks stay there for a longer period of time or not, but it's a residential use. And an extended stay, we would consider that a hotel or a motel and a commercial use. There's a question about that comes up a little bit later as well in the presentation, because they do feel similar, and I certainly understand that. I think it's sort of the way that we're imagining these as being more of it's like an apartment. It's more like that. It's intended to be a truly residential kind of use, as opposed to a more commercial, transient sort of hotel, motel type of thing. The extended stay makes it a little bit fuzzy. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and it's just, those are being used basically like SROs, like Southern Oregon. They all became SROs when people were displaced by the wildfires. Yep. So I'm not sure it makes a difference code or zoning wise. I'm just kind of trying to anticipate how down the road we might be confronted with questions like this.
Yeah, and by putting, if I could add the 30 days or more, or sort of on a monthly basis, that's how we're distinguishing between more of a commercial use and more of a residential use.
Yeah.
And so if there is an extended stay hotel that you can stay there for 2 weeks, then that would not, I think, be considered an SRO. Right. But if they were only renting it a month or more, I think it would be potentially considered an SRO. And many motels or hotels do kind of make the transition, I guess, not necessarily here, but in where they exist, they'll get bought up and converted into an SRO sometimes.
Yeah, and you even see, like in Portland, I know people who have Airbnb units that they only rent by the month because it allows them to circumvent. It's a different tax structure under the city of Portland's business licensing. Right. So it's just an interesting. It's interesting how we define home. That's effectively what we're talking about, is how do you convert that into policy and code, and is it appropriate, and does it reflect the changing realities of what home is for some people?
Right.
Anyway.
We're trying to broaden that as much as we can. But we may miss the mark every once. So if there's, we're hoping to.
We may just find out along the way.
I think Councilor Beatty's has her hand raised.
Yeah. So when you guys started this, somebody said we don't have any. And we definitely, I guess, don't have any purpose-built SROs like those pictures you showed us. But I do think we have boarding houses. We don't license them. We don't. But I mean, I know for sure we had one in Island Station where they had 5 or more rooms that they were renting individually back 10 years ago. And I guess that's my question, is what happens with these sort of naturally occurring larger old homes where somebody just wants to do this, will they need to come through and get a license to do that? And sort of what's the plan for those?
Well, from a use standpoint, I mean, we are proposing that they would be permitted by right in any zone that allows a multi-unit home. So if we're, because we're focusing on our high-density residential zones, so they would be permitted to do that. But I think your question is more about the licensing or sort of, or the business registration piece of it, because as a multi-unit, they would need a business registration for that, just like just like our apartment complexes do. So I think that may be where we start to grab some of those or understand what's happening there as they shift away from a single, detached dwelling into more of an SRO situation. So I think, yeah, we probably would need to talk to our business registration folks maybe to understand how, what does that mean, in this universe of types of homes that we're providing or that we're allowing.
Well, and I also think about it in terms of life safety, frankly. When you start talking about putting cooking facilities in, even though it's not a full kitchen, countertop cooking facilities and other things, I do worry about, we've seen there was a horrible situation in the Bay Area 8 or 9 years ago where there was a de facto boarding house that went up in flames and a lot of people lost their lives. I guess that's what I worry is that we don't have an inspection. We don't have a safety code if people are doing that kind of thing. And that's, more my worry than whether we get our business license fee or not.
I think if I could, we do have an inspection process for short-term rentals, and the building official does do inspections on that sort of thing. And so I'm sort of thinking out loud a little bit, but if someone were shifting this over and wanting to put, some sort of a cooking facility, a stove, something, into, or shift something over into something like that, I'm wondering that there would be some sort of process or something if they're starting to wire in different things that the building official would want to get involved in something like that. I think they just would normally,
Yeah, well, I mean, these days you don't even need to do any wiring changes. Countertop can be a microwave. It can be a $75 single induction burner, which is actually very safe to use and has basically all but eliminated the fire risk we had associated with things like a electric coil burner. So I don't want us to go down the over prescribing and discouraging of affordable housing forms path. I get a little worried about that on the other side of the equation. So yeah, I think it's just really interesting. And this sort of raises a question that I've had in the back of my mind. And every time I say things like this to you guys, I always feel bad. So know that I'm feeling bad, even as I'm saying it. But in my conversations with landlords in town, they really don't feel like they have any connection to the planning department or know what's going on with the city in terms of regulation. So I always in the back of my mind think, wouldn't it be great if we had just kind of a go-to group of a handful of landlords that we could run these kinds of questions past? Because I do think that there's implications that are clear as day to them that we just don't see on our side because we don't deal with it day to day. And they may have some really valuable thoughts to offer around things like having multiple housemates effectively, and how do you manage that, and what do you need to do in terms of safety, because they want to preserve their property as much as we want to preserve people's safety. Anyway, because I know you need one more thing to do, but.
So there is at least one purpose-built SRO. I don't know that it's currently being used that way. It's up on 29th. Turn of the century building. If you drive down the street from the east, you would see stairways going up the side of the building all the way to the third floor. I think it's got 3 floors. also, there's a lot of folks who have bigger, older houses that either a group of roommates rent or somebody lives there and they rent out 4 or 5 or 6 bedrooms, which is the point of my little diatribe is what's magic about 5?
Is it building, or no, it's state definition of SRO? Where did the 5?
I think that 5 or more is, I'm trying to remember how we did decide on that.
Because there's certainly some of the older houses in town that have 6 and 7 bedrooms, and people could easily do that. And I could envision somebody building a house in a medium density residential area that looks like a house.
Yep.
And has 6 or 7 bedrooms, 8 bedrooms, and a group of roommates rented out. And how different would that be from a pair of duplexes on the same property, right? With a family in each duplex, or all the different iterations that we currently are envisioning with our multifamily or our missing middle housing. I want to be careful about getting too prescriptive, too low to forestall something like that being purpose-built, because I think there are a lot of people for whom that's an appropriate form of living at that moment in their lives, right? Straight out of college, don't have a great income yet, on the other end of life. There's a lot of folks for whom a far less expensive, those kind of rooms rent for $500 and $600 instead of $1,300 for a studio market rate. So I would want to make sure that our definition doesn't preclude somebody doing something like that in the
moderate density zones is what.
Yeah.
I see.
Because that number 5 is where you've cut it off then for somebody to do that purposefully, and you've limited it to certain zones.
Yeah, and I think to respond to that, I think there's a little bit of a difference between when a house is acting as one household. They're renting out rooms, but they're all on the lease with the landlord. And some states have banned sort of the renting out by room. You have to rent out the whole house to a group of people. And so there's probably a lot of instances where there's more than 5 bedrooms and everyone's on the lease, or some people are on the lease and they're sort of on the side, paying each other. So there's a lot going into that. And there are other approaches that we encountered in other jurisdictions, sort of distinguishing between household living, where everyone's sort of sharing everything and there's not separated units, and sort of group living. So there's there are other approaches, but I think the 5 was really focusing on where you're renting out the individual rooms. It was, it seemed like a threshold that other places used. And I'm not sure if the state has a definition of SRO that has a threshold, but I can look into that to see if that's where it originated from.
At one point, the state had a law, and I thought it got rescinded, but it was something to the effect that no more than 4 unrelated adults could cohabit. That got rescinded, yeah. So I imagine that might have been where that number came from initially. But I would like to see if there's anything that limits us there, and then potentially consider a higher number.
If I could, so it's 5 or more is an SRO. And so when you're saying a higher number, I just want to, because I just want to make sure I'm sussing out.
8 or more. I don't know what that higher number might be.
Oh, I see what you're saying, so that they could be permitted in the RMD. That, right, I understand. So we're upping the threshold
Right.
to be able to capture larger home conversions in our RMD zone. Got
Right,
it.
yeah,
Okay.
not thinking about those things that look like hotels.
Yep.
But things that look like houses and function the same way.
We'll come back with more information for you at the hearing on that.
I just have a quick question. So I was thinking about the countertop appliances and the refrigerator, because I stayed in some of these smaller, these SROs before, where each of us had our own bedroom, but there was 2 bathrooms, so two shared one, 2 shared the other, and then in the center was the kitchen. So we all had access to the kitchen. But we weren't allowed to, you weren't allowed to have anything in your room, like a burner plate, obviously because of the hazard. But if I'm just thinking if in the code, if you could put a requirement that there has to be a shared kitchen or shared access, or at least access to a kitchen to prevent that from happening. I mean, you could have a mini fridge in your room, that's was totally fine, but just to prevent
Yeah.
any accidents or anything, a burner being left on, just a requirement that there's a shared kitchen. And the existing kitchen there could be the
Right.
shared kitchen, and just as long as people have access to it.
We specify in the definition that the room can't have a kitchen, but we define kitchen really specifically because then otherwise, then it's a separate dwelling unit if it has a full kitchen, and we understand, the way we've understood a full kitchen for us for the code, what's an ADU, what's not kind of thing is having that 220 service, like, so you have an actual stove as your cooking facility. Can people make do with a microwave? Sure they can. So, but it's a way for us to distinguish between a full dwelling unit when STCs are assessed and that kind of thing. So that's how we're trying to do that. But it sounds like what you're asking is to not have a cooking, any kind of a cooking appliance.
Well,
Is there something more?
I just don't want anybody to be denied, like, because it's one thing to assume the kitchen, right? But not,
Right.
I don't want anyone to be denied access to a kitchen.
Of course.
If some people
Yeah.
don't, if some people can't have a burner plate, or if they're told they're not allowed to, but they can't use the kitchen, it just, some landlords may do that, may restrict certain people for whatever reason on access
Gotcha.
to it, just
Okay.
a basic kitchen. And I think
Yeah.
a kitchen is just a necessity to have if in a
Right.
dwelling, and access to a kitchen. Just not having a kitchen, but just access to a kitchen.
Yep, okay. We'll take another look at that, make sure that that's really clear.
Thank you.
Okay. Great. Okay.
It's good to see little man has not outgrown certain habits.
Okay. All right, we're going to stay on uses for just a second as well. Because as you touch one part of the code and it opens up a whole bunch of things. And one of the things that was different across the high density zones is the allowance of office uses in the R1B. It was the only one that allowed that kind of a commercial use. And so once we started looking at offices and then trying to figure out, we use the term office very differently across the code. And as we update sections, we update just those and not the rest of them. So kind of Cliff Notes version of what we're trying to do here is that right now our code has 3 office types in some sections of the code. Other zones just say office or traditional office or other things. So we're trying to make these changes throughout the code for consistency. So wherever offices are allowed, it's the same one. They're called the same thing. And so what we're proposing is to kind of consolidate the 3 office types that we talk about in the code down to 2, so that we would make that distinction between a production-related office, and that's the one that we use in the downtown zone. That's kind of where that started. The one that doesn't have a lot of foot traffic versus the professional administrative office type. And so just kind of combine professional administrative office into one type and production-related office. And those are the 2 that we have. We don't have 3. And that we would, and you would see in the code changes that wherever it says office, we call out either production related or traditional so that it's consistent throughout the code, because otherwise we just had a bunch of different kinds of offices everywhere and it didn't make a lot of sense. So we're, again, just trying to provide some consistency and streamlining throughout the code to make that right. That's bugged me for a while, and so I wanted to fix that.
So, and what the defining distinction between those?
Yeah.
Because there's some gray, I can think of different things that
Yeah.
would,
So the way the code talks about them, it provides examples, but it also talks about a high level of foot traffic as part of the idea. And so the idea of the street activation and that kind of thing. So the production-related office is the one that doesn't see a lot of foot traffic. There aren't a lot of folks coming in, customers or clients or anything.
call
It's
center or something like that.
Precisely. And then everything else is a professional or administrative office, lawyers, but everything else is something else. But that way, we'll still maintain that distinction because it's called out in the downtown code as to what kinds of offices are allowed on the first floor. So I didn't want to open that up again. So we're kind of keeping that office the same, but throughout the code, making sure that anywhere else that it's referencing office, it's calling out the same kind of office. So we don't have to debate what kind of office it is every time. As fun as those meetings are, we didn't want to do that anymore. So that's the office use piece of it. Okay.
So
Yes.
I do want to talk about that.
Okay.
That was developed, like you just indicated, that was developed largely because of downtown and trying to activate downtown space. I even wish it were stricter than it is in some ways, but I guess I have a couple various questions on this. I mean, the definitions don't cause me so much heartburn, but looking at where we allow offices under the limited and under the permitted. So the limited is a 2,000 square foot limit you're proposing.
What page are you looking at, Lisa?
Oh, I don't, I'm looking at the map right now, so I don't know. I just remember seeing that. It was, well, it's the chart on WS7 says this, but there's there's text somewhere that, that describes that difference.
Thanks.
So we're going to start allowing offices in places like, that traditionally haven't had offices. And I guess it seems to me like, where are we going to run afoul of, I mean, are we going to create some tension with the home occupancy rules? Home occupancy has largely been things that don't have much traffic. You can't have a high traffic business as a home occupancy. We're going to start allowing in more, more traditionally residential zones, offices. What does that mean in terms of that issue? What does that mean in terms of parking, et cetera? And now that I look at it, I've been looking at this whole list of 3, wondering why you guys hadn't gone to 1. Which had been the discussion in the CPIC, was consolidating all to 1. And I guess, and then when you look at that chart on page 7, WS7, there's really not much that distinguishes the 3. And so again, I was like, why aren't we just going to 1? This is one of the few things that distinguishes the R1B from the other 2. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, this and personal business services, which are allowed outright in R1B and limited in R2 and R3. And as far as I'm reading this chart, that's the only differences.
Building
Is that
height.
the only reason we're keeping 3 and not consolidating into 1?
There is a difference in building height between one of those and the other 2.
Yes.
Maximum building height.
And
Because I had the same thought. I remember the same conversation from that committee.
If I could for 1 second, because great segue into what we're getting to, so that's perfect. So this chart kind of shows, I've updated what the uses are as we've just talked about them, but kept how they're permitted or not in the zones. So you can see that you're right. The R1B, that's our sort of businessy high density zone. And the other commercial uses are either are a conditional use or not at all in the remainder of the high density zones. So you're correct, Councilor Beatty, that what we're looking to do in the consolidation is to allow more things in the other high density zones, but the discussion was that they would be limited in size versus the R1B, kind of understanding that the R3, for example, is more sort of getting closer into more of a residential zone. And so it was a way of kind of cutting it in the middle, I guess, a little bit. We're going to allow some things, but we're not going to let them be, as big as they want to be. And to your question about the home occupation, well, you're right. Home occupation or home office that's primarily it's a residence. I live there and I have my home office in the house. They're just offices. They're not combined with a residential use. So there is a difference between these commercial uses versus the home occupations. And in the discussion with the Planning Commission, this idea of still maintaining a couple of these high-density residential zones is still being predominantly residential, but we would allow some commercial to bleed in, was sort of part of how we're sort of inching our way towards not having just one high-density zone. We can certainly have that discussion if that's what the council would like to see, coming into the public hearing with what would it look like if we glued them all together? It would change densities. The densities would go up, of course, from where they are right now. Building height would go up. Let's see. Yeah, so you can see that in this chart, so things would increase because we would not propose that things go down so that, a lot that's in the R1B would now not suddenly be a 35-foot height limit, right? Everybody would come up to basically the R1B if we were going to consolidate them into one. So if you sort of look at what the R1B allows, and I'm just sort of taking this out to where we could have this discussion, then we would create one high-density residential zone, and all of those properties would be basically what is currently in the R1B. So 40-foot height, 45-foot building height, 50% lot coverage, 15% vegetation, and a minimum density of 25, maximum of 32. Like, if that's sort of the idea, and then if we look at what would be permitted, then we would be permitting business and personal, so salons and that kind of thing by right, offices by right. It would change, some of those high density zones that currently allow some of those things, or we would be wanting to allow a little bit of those things into something quite different, I guess I would say. And we're certainly open to having that conversation. I think densities are something that the housing needs assessment is going to be looking at too. Are these the right densities for things? The Planning Commission did, want you folks to talk about hotels and motels and what should we be doing about that. And then we do have the manufactured dwelling park question, which I do have a slide about towards here, but I feel like the door's been open now to talk about a full consolidation here. So open to having that discussion. And if there's, I guess I'll call it appetite on part of the council to look at that, or how are we kind of massaging some of these things, allowing a few more things than are currently allowed, or do you want us to kind of go big or go home, so to speak?
So from the standpoint of the sort of 20-minute neighborhood goal, which has been, since we did our vision, something that we've been moving towards, the idea of allowing more things in more places is good, just sort of generally broadly speaking. And I do believe in our high density zones, we have step down rules as they near neighborhoods, right? They have
They're
to.
transition zones, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So even if we did allow all the high density zones to go to 45 feet, when they got next to a neighborhood, they couldn't be 45 feet at the edge of the neighborhood. So I guess I would need to hear an argument of why not.
Right. And if I may, part of this too, we have so many projects that sort of layer on one another because we're sort of about to kick off the Neighborhood Hubs project too, which was a question that came from the Planning Commission as well, sort of, well, how are these different from neighborhood hubs? You know, and not all the neighborhood hubs will be a zone and, you know, do all of those things either. So we are starting to do work, I think, and then we'll redo some stuff later as things start to catch up on itself. But these certainly do cover sort of more ground than, you know, than the neighborhood hubs. And some of the hubs are just things that may be in existing residential zones and it's sort of a pop-up. There are a lot of different things, I think. But I think, you know, I don't know that I'm going to argue against a full consolidation. We can certainly lay out what that would look like and what would that mean, and see. That's not something that, you know, we thought about. This was sort of a kind of a moderate consolidation, I think. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I would be concerned with a full consolidation that moved everything to 45 feet and 50% lot coverage. I do think that would require more conversation with the neighborhoods that are involved. And even this office use, I guess, I feel like we need to have conversation with the neighborhoods that are involved about how they feel about that. And maybe it is a discussion better left for the neighborhood hubs discussion. But I mean, I think if suddenly you get a 2,000 square foot, you know, office that people are coming and going to on your residential street, I could see people, you know, being concerned about that. And now that we allow 1,500 foot lots, we could have, you know, lots of little 1,500 foot lots, each with a 2,000 square foot office, you know, each with a 2-story, 1,000 square foot footprint office. So we could see neighborhoods becoming, you know, office centers. I want to overstate that risk because we haven't seen a ton of office come to our downtown other than doctor's offices, medical offices.
Right, and the trend is actually the reverse of that right now. You're seeing in downtown Portland, you're seeing Class B office buildings looking at switching over to residential.
Right, but you are seeing, I mean, suburbs are seeing office relocate out of downtown Portland too, though, because places don't need the size of office they needed pre-pandemic. And so they can do with a smaller office. And there are, you know, I think there's a lot of shift going on that we don't know where it's going to go.
Well, I do think the nature of work is changing. And I think that many neighborhoods are already home to businesses that attract significant traffic at times of day. And some of those are ones we sorely need. Home daycares, those operate out of people's houses. We have an absolute just mind-bending shortage of affordable daycare options. And those are the most affordable options for people, hands down. So I don't want to say that parking should prevent home daycares or other essential uses from occurring. And, you know, I think that when we're talking about this, I actually agree with the mayor that I would be interested in hearing a little more about what it would look like to consolidate these three. You know, given and really understanding that there is that step down and that we have mechanisms in place to provide transition within the code, no matter how dense an area is allowed to be. I think oftentimes in our conversations about code, we end up conflating what could be with what will be. So I want to push back a little on always going to the worst case scenario, because we never seem to go to the best case scenario, which is, here and there, you have an office. It's a place where people make money. Maybe they have a really short commute to get to work. Maybe it's allowing a couple that really can't both work at home to manage to still live together because one of them can go down the street to a co-housing arrangement. I don't know, but you know, I think that there's a lot of different ways that we can think about this. And it would be nice to know the planning department's perspective on what that would look like. Because you all are the ones that have to deal with that on a day-to-day basis.
And I think, also our multifamily zones are not like interspersed throughout our medium density zone. I mean, it's pretty consolidated. So it's not like there's a whole bunch of neighborhoods that all of a sudden there's going to be 2,000 square foot office
Right.
occurring.
Well, but there are a lot of blocks that are currently, single family homes. They could be
Sure. That's true.
apartments, but they're not, I mean, I'd like to know what outreach was done to the neighborhoods on this, and it's really historic Milwaukie, Ardenwald, I guess, and Hector Campbell, I guess, is where King Road is. Yeah.
I guess if we're going to do outreach to the neighborhoods, then I would also suggest that we need to do outreach to the business community and ask them what would the benefit be there. Because, I don't know what businesses aren't happening because the space isn't currently available for them in Milwaukie. I don't know what services or goods or whatever else, what jobs are not being created because we don't have the flexibility in our code right now.
Lots of businesses.
Well, the staff report did indicate that there have been requests for some kind of small commercial. So it'd be good to hear what kind of examples of that. But also, could staff clarify the daycare? I don't know that we need any changes to allow the home daycare, or do we?
We do not. Home daycares are protected by state law up to a certain number of students. So that's in the code, and it's clarified as such, but there isn't anything that we need to change in the code. They are permitted.
Yeah, and I was only calling that out as an example of an existing use of a home in a residential area that is a small business that already attracts considerable traffic and parking at certain times of day. That was the only reason I brought it up.
If I could, Councilor Beatty, to your question about the requests that we've had for businesses, the ones that we most often were getting were requests for folks to open small salons or nail salons or that sort of thing. And because in the R1B, currently we only allow offices. So that's why we were proposing to add personal and business services as part of that, as a category of use to help broaden that. We did not propose retail as an example, but because we were getting these kinds of requests for those particular kinds of small businesses. So that's why we inserted those. But office uses are permitted as conditional uses in the other high density zones. The proposal was to open that up a bit to that limited use with that limitation on the size. So. But okay. So we've sort of talked about this chart a bunch anyway, but this is as part of the currently proposed consolidation. You're right. The key differences across them are the commercial uses, personal business services, and the office uses, as well as manufactured dwelling parks currently are permitted in our R3 zone via a type 3 review. So those, and they're not permitted in the R2 or the R1B. So when we're looking at kind of what are the changes as part of this proposed consolidation, there are 3. Then those are they, as far as a use standpoint. So as proposed in the consolidation, this is what the map would look like. And what this does is it adds 6 lots of R2.5 to the existing R3. And then there are 4 lots of R1 that get glued to R2. So the changes as far as what lots are getting rezoned, there are 11 of them that would end up getting rezoned and have a new name. But that's kind of the effect of what that means. The 7 lots in the R2.5 are the ones we saw around the King Road Shopping Center. And then the R2 would bring in the 4 R1 lots, which are existing apartment complexes now. And then that northern portion of the hillside development that was rezoned as part of their planned development. So those are the R1s are all existing apartment complexes right now that would get pulled into R2, just as a way of minimizing the number of lots. We do have too many zones. We don't need 5. Is it 3? Is it 1? We can talk about that, but I don't think it needs to be 5. Yes. And again, this is that development standards table that I talked about. So the height, so as part of the consolidation, the height and the lot coverage and the minimum vegetation stay the same as part of that piece of it. What does change is the density. Will be affected. The R3 density, maximum density does scoot up a little bit to a little over 17 from 14. And then the R2, we're pulling in the R1 density. So it's that 25 to 32. So those are the kind of the key changes from a development standards standpoint as part of that consolidation. Okay. As part of that density discussion, and we covered this, I think, in the staff report, we want to eliminate the minimum site size requirement for the table or for the, as part of the high density zones, specifically for multifamily development. That's where this gets calculated. This has been it's sort of this additional standard that you have to meet before you even get to dwelling or the actual density. You have to have a minimum site size. This has become problematic for a couple of our existing multifamily developments where they can't add any more units because they're actually already over density because of the site size piece. So we would like to not add this layer of complexity to the multi-unit dwellings and just use density as a way of governing how many units can be on a site. And we did do the math, and there are a couple of those developments that have talked to us, and this would allow them actually to be able to add a couple of units into their existing buildings, create a couple of studios or something like that. But the site size is a pretty big limitation, more so than certainly than the minimum or maximum density is when it comes to that. So we propose to eliminate that. So the Planning Commission recommended approval of the amendment package, and then they did have a couple of recommendations for the council. First, to find ways to preserve and protect manufactured dwelling parks. And then also that the council should discuss the amendment that proposes to allow hotels and motels by conditional use in the R3 and the R2 zones. They're currently prohibited. There was sort of a split decision on that from the commission, so they wanted the council to talk about that hotel motel piece a little bit more. But if I could talk about the manufactured dwelling parks for a second. So we have one manufactured dwelling park that's currently in city limits right now. It's on King Road near Linwood. And in looking at kind of the ways that the city could work to preserve and protect manufactured dwelling parks. So state law is really clear on kind of what can happen at the state level when a manufactured dwelling park wants to close or redevelop. And I don't pretend to be an expert on this, but these bullet points sort of summarize how the state law works in the ORS. They have to notify the state. Tenants get a 1-year notice in advance of that happening. There are payments to the tenants that are codified in the state law. Right now it's $6,000 if you have a single manufactured dwelling, manufactured home, $8,000 for a double, and then $10,000 for a triple. So those are payments made by the landlord to the tenants, and they are to get tax credits from the state as part of that process as well. The state law, though, does have a very clear prohibition on the city enacting any additional regulations after 2007, so we're past that. So we do have to rely on state law as part of this piece. However, there are a couple of options. The city of Portland in 2018 created a manufactured dwelling park zone, and they zoned their existing manufactured dwelling parks into this new zone. And that new zone doesn't allow any other housing except for manufactured dwelling parks. So the way to kind of get around or to handle the preservation piece of the manufactured dwelling park is that if one of those Parks wants to redevelop or close, they would have to actually go through a full map amendment process to do so. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but it adds this extra layer of work for the landlord to do.
And that doesn't run afoul of the state law prohibition?
The city of Portland's had it since 2018, and they have
Oh,
not
okay.
reported any appeals or any issues with that new zone. So,
Okay.
no. There's also an agency toolkit that was created as a collaboration between the state and other agencies that has all of these steps that for folks that run into or facing relocation or a closure or something like that. Clackamas County handles that. So I talked to our community development director about that, and the county has a robust process that helps folks that are facing this sort of thing. So from a city standpoint, the state law is there. There is a zoning kind of component to this if it's something that the council wants to look at. I would recommend that we talk about that a bit more and actually talk to our manufactured dwelling park, folks that are already here before I wouldn't recommend that we try to do that in this package, I guess is my point. But it's certainly something that, we're happy to talk with you about. But I just kind of wanted to address what our options are and what there is out there already at the state level as well. So to wrap this up, so we do have some questions about, just making sure, do you have any questions? You've provided some direction for some additional information that you'd like us to bring back to the hearing. Do you have any issues about some of, what we've proposed here? If you do have questions or some discussion about the allowance of hotels and motels in the R3 and the R2 as a conditional use, there was quite a bit of discussion with the Planning Commission about bed and breakfasts and vacation rentals and hotels, motels, and the likelihood of any of those getting built. And so they were sort of starting to get into a little more of kind of wanting to allow more things. But again, it wasn't unanimous on the Planning Commission from the hotel motel piece of it. So that's why they wanted you folks to talk about it. And then it would like some kind of official direction and wanting to come back to the hearing with a full consolidation down to one, if that's something that you'd like.
So our hotels, am I recalling correctly that our downtown zone allows outright
Yes.
hotels? That's what I was thinking. And that would probably be the only zone in the city that allows outright,
I think that's right.
correct?
We don't allow them in the general mixed use or any of those others? No? Okay.
No. Commercial lodging is, sorry, the binder. Commercial lodging is permitted by right in the downtown, but it is permitted by right in the GMU and the NMU as well.
It is,
So,
okay.
yes, yep.
All right.
Well, I mean, we've talked about motels a lot in that moving forward Milwaukie package. There was some thought for where Axle Tree now is. There was some thought that was going to be a hotel at one point in time. And we talked about hotels a lot. We're not seeing them being built. In fact, we're seeing, some hotels being converted to other uses. So it seems to me like maybe we have enough space for hotels to go. Until we see some demand that somebody wants one somewhere else.
Yeah, seemingly these days, the highest value is for housing
Okay.
on almost every piece of land. And so I don't perceive a crying need for more zones that allow hotels. Like Lisa said, it's an industry that seems to be on a little bit of a downward trend.
Sure, the short-term rentals have not been good for the hotel business, so, yeah.
Okay. Other things that we should be prepared to talk about at the hearing?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with your office definitions. I just guess I am still concerned about offices in areas where we haven't allowed them before. So I want to drive some of those areas and think about that. Or walk some of those areas and think about that. And as far as the consolidation, I guess the more I think about that, even though I was sort of the one who brought it up, the more I think about that, the more I think that's a discussion better merged with the hubs discussion. Because I do think there may be areas, if we, depending on where we go with hubs, there may be areas where we want to allow the 45-foot height to stimulate a hub development. But that, to me, that doesn't mean all of these, 300 acres. So.
Just as a counterpoint, I'm still interested
Okay.
in the
So am I.
potential of consolidating. I'm having a hard time picking out a downside.
We'll put it together for discussion.
I will say one of the comments I've heard about the Monroe apartments, and I don't know if it's true, I heard from someone who lives in the other apartment complex across the road complaining about the height. And she said that they were told that they would still be able to see the tree line across 224 once this building was built, and they were shown some kind of scale drawings or something. And I don't know if this was at the neighborhood meeting or where, but and she's like, there's no way, we can't see anything, we can't see any trees beyond the buildings. The buildings block everything. So, I mean, like I said, I was not at the meeting. I don't know what was said, but that is one of the complaints I've heard.
Mayor, if this part of the meeting is concluded, we do have an executive session tonight. If you all were open to meeting for a few minutes with the HR director, she could go home instead of waiting for the rest of the night before leaving.
Everybody good on this? Okay.
I'm not.
Okay. Do I have,
At the end of the regular session script, I can pull it.
it's on the regular session?
Yeah.
Okay. After the work session, preceding the regular session, council will meet in executive session pursuant to Oregon Revised Statute 192.6602I to review and evaluate the employment-related performance of the chief executive officer of any public body, a public officer, employee, or staff member who does not request an open hearing. With that, our work session is adjourned. We'll be back at 6 o'clock.
Lisa, I'll launch the exec session. 5 minutes to get it set up.